The great hall of the Stonefall Pack was a cavern of shadows and whispers that night. High ceilings, carved from the living rock of the mountain, arched overhead like the ribs of some slumbering stone giant. Torches flickered in iron sconces, their dancing flames throwing long, shifting shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to mimic the nervous twitching of the people gathered below. The air was thick, not just with the smoke from the fire pit at the room center, but with a heavy, sinking feeling of dread. It was the night of the Alpha ceremony, a night that should have been filled with hope and celebration, but instead felt like a funeral for a dream that had never come true. At the far end of the hall, seated on a massive wooden throne that was more a piece of the forest than a piece of furniture, was Pax, the Alpha of the Stonefall Pack. To any who looked upon him, he was the picture of power. His shoulders were broad, straining the fabric of his dark tunic, and his arms, crossed over his chest, were corded with muscle earned from leading his pack, from fighting, from surviving. His face, handsome and sharp, was like something carved from granite, his jaw set in a firm, unyielding line. But if you dared to look into his eyes, you would see a different story. They were the color of a stormy sky, and tonight, they held a deep and weary sorrow. This ceremony was his burden, his yearly public shame. The rules of the ceremony were as old as the pack itself. Every unmated woman of a certain age was to present herself before the Alpha. They would walk, one by one, down the long stretch of woven rug that led to his throne. If one of them was his true, destined mate, a magical bond would awaken. An invisible force would connect them, and for a moment, a soft, ethereal light would glow around the couple, a sign to everyone that their Alpha had found his Luna, his other half. It was a beautiful tradition. Or it would have been, if it had ever worked. The line of women was long and impressive. It was Pax's third year as Alpha, and this was his third ceremony. The first year had been filled with nervous excitement. The second year with tense hope. The third year was filled with a desperate last-chance kind of energy. The women who stepped forward were the strongest, the smartest, the most beautiful the pack had to offer. First came Briar, a huntress with sharp eyes and a confident stride. She held her head high as she walked the length of the hall, stopping before Pax, her gaze meeting his directly. The pack held its breath. A full minute passed. The torches crackled. A log shifted in the fire pit. Nothing happened. The light did not come. A muscle in Pax's jaw twitched, and Briar's shoulders slumped just a fraction before she bowed her head and retreated, her pride wounded. Next was Serena, known for her cleverness and sweet voice. She approached with a gentle smile, her steps light. She truly hoped she could be the one to ease the loneliness she sometimes saw in her Alpha's eyes. She stopped before him, her smile hopeful. Silence. The air remained still, the magic dormant. Her smile faded and she hurried away, disappearing into the crowd. One after another they came. The strong, the kind, the brave. Warriors with scars on their arms and gardeners with soil under their nails. Each time the result was the same. A painful, public rejection. The hopeful murmurs of the pack slowly died down, replaced by an anxious, buzzing whisper. What would happen to them if their Alpha never found a mate? A pack without a Luna was like a heart without a beat, unstable, incomplete. Pax felt each failure like a physical blow. He kept his posture rigid, his face a mask of stoic control, but inside, his spirit was crumbling. He was beginning to believe the terrible thought that had been whispering in the back of his mind for months. Perhaps he had no true mate. Perhaps he was destined to lead alone, to be forever lonely in a crowd of his own people. The weight of it was crushing him. As the last woman in the main line, a skilled tracker named Flora, turned away with a sad shake of her head, Pax felt a cold emptiness settle in his chest. This was it. It was over. He took a slow, deep breath, preparing to stand, to dismiss everyone, to officially end this painful charade forever. It seems there is no one, he began, his voice a low, tired rumble that echoed in the quiet hall. But before the final word could leave his lips, a small movement at the very back of the crowd caught his eye. The people gathered there were shifting, parting, not out of respect but out of surprise. A figure was stepping out from the deepest shadows, from the place where the Omegas, the lowest-ranked members of the pack, usually stayed. It was Felicity. A soft, disbelieving ripple spread through the pack. Felicity was the one who never spoke. No one could remember the sound of her voice. She was quiet and gentle, always watching with her large, thoughtful eyes, always helping in the background without seeking praise or notice. Most of the pack barely thought of her at all, or if they did, it was with a sort of distant pity. She was small, with a delicate frame that seemed made for hiding, not for standing before an Alpha. Her hair was a simple brown, and her dress was plain. She was utterly ordinary in a hall full of remarkable women who had just failed. Someone at the back stifled a laugh. Another whispered, "What is she doing?" The sound was not kind. But Felicity did not seem to hear them. Her head was bowed, not in fear, but in concentration, as if she was gathering every last bit of her courage. She took one step, then another, onto the woven rug. Her steps were silent, hesitant at first, but with each one they grew more sure. Pax watched her, his exhaustion momentarily replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. He knew who she was, of course. Every pack member was known to their alpha. But he had never truly seen her, not like this. He saw the way her hands, clenched at her sides, were trembling. He saw the determined set of her slender shoulders. He saw the way she lifted her chin as she finally reached the space before his throne. And then she looked up. Her eyes met his. They were not a stormy gray like his. They were a warm, deep brown, like the rich earth after a rain. And in them he did not see pity or ambition or desperation. He saw a quiet understanding, a deep, unspoken kindness, and a strength so solid it felt like bedrock. In that single, silent look, she held his gaze and did not let go. And then it happened. A soft gasp went up from someone in the crowd. A warm, golden light began to glow around Felicity's feet, like sunlight pooling around her. It swirled upward, wrapping around her in a gentle, luminous embrace. At the same moment, an identical light erupted from the base of Pax's throne, swirling around his legs, his torso, until he was encased in its radiance. The two lights reached for each other, stretching across the space between them until they met and merged, connecting Pax and Felicity in a brilliant, beautiful arch of pure, magical energy. The hall was flooded with a warm, comforting glow that pushed back all the shadows and silenced every whisper. The light was so bright it made Pax blink, and he felt a sensation he had never felt before. It was like a missing piece of his soul. A piece he never knew was gone, had suddenly slotted back into place. A profound sense of rightness, of peace, washed over him, so powerful it made his knees feel weak. The empty, cold space inside his chest was filled with a sudden, overwhelming warmth. The golden light slowly faded, but the feeling remained, a tangible thread of connection humming between him and the silent girl standing before him. The entire pack was frozen, their mouths agape in utter astonishment. No one moved. No one spoke. Pax rose from his throne. He was a tall man, and his standing presence usually commanded fear or respect. Now he moved with a new, strange gentleness. He walked the few steps to stand directly in front of Felicity. He looked down at her, into those deep brown eyes that were wide with their own shock and wonder. He could see the rapid flutter of her pulse in her throat. He knew in that moment with a certainty that went deeper than bone, deeper than blood. The ceremony was not a failure. It had been waiting for her. His voice when he finally spoke was different. The tired rumble was gone, replaced by a low, resonant tone that carried absolute authority, yet was softer than anyone had ever heard it. He did not ask her. He did not consult the elders. He made a declaration not just to her but to every single person who was watching. "The ceremony is complete," he said, his words falling into the stunned silence like stones into a still pond. "Felicity is my true mate. She is your Luna." He did not offer her his hand. Instead, he simply turned, trusting that she would follow. And as he walked back towards his private chambers, he heard the soft, nearly silent patter of her footsteps behind him. The Alpha and his silent Omega, leaving a hall full of broken traditions and the beginning of a new, unbelievable story. The Alpha's private living quarters were a world away from the great hall's echoing grandeur. It was a spacious suite of rooms built into the mountain itself, with one entire wall opening onto a wide stone balcony that overlooked the sleeping forest. The furniture was heavy and solid, carved from dark wood, and furs were scattered across the stone floor. It was a place that spoke of masculine strength, but also of a stark loneliness. There were no personal trinkets, no colorful weavings, nothing that spoke of comfort or a woman's touch. It was a fortress, not a home. Pax led Felicity inside and closed the heavy wooden door, the sound of the final latch clicking into place shutting out the muffled chaos of the pack. For a long moment, they simply stood there in the quiet of the main room, the only sound the crackling of a low fire in the hearth. The reality of their situation settled upon them both, heavy and strange. This powerful Alpha and this silent Omega, bound together by a magic neither fully understood, were now alone. "This will be your room," Pax said, his voice unusually gruff as he gestured to a doorway leading off the main chamber. He did not lead her to his own. The bond was one thing, forcing intimacy was another. The room was simple but clean, with a bed, a chest, and a small window looking out into the night. Felicity stepped inside, her fingers lightly brushing the rough wool of the blanket on the bed. She looked back at him, and for the first time, Pax saw a flicker of true fear in her eyes. It was not fear of him, he thought, but fear of this immense, sudden change. The first days were a landscape of quiet awkwardness. Pax, a man of action and command, found himself at a loss. How did one converse with someone who could not answer? He would try, asking simple questions about her comfort, about the food brought to them, about the view from the balcony. Felicity's response was always the same. She would retrieve a small leather-bound notebook and a stub of pencil from a pocket in her dress, write a few neat words and show it to him. The stew is good. The view is very large. Her answers were polite, factual, and created a wall of silence he did not know how to scale. His frustration was a slow-burning ember. He was alpha. He was used to being heard, to his words having immediate weight. Her silence felt like a rejection of his very nature. He decided action was better than words. Instead of trying to talk, he began to show. The next morning he led her to the Pax Kitchens, a bustling, warm place full of enticing smells. He did not speak to the cooks, but simply took a warm, honey-drizzled roll from a basket and handed it to her. Her eyes widened in surprise, and then she gave him a small, genuine smile that made something tight in his chest loosen. Another day he took her to the Pax Library, a small, dusty room filled with scrolls and a few precious books. He pointed out a history of the Stonefall Pack, watching as she carefully traced the illustrated runes on the parchment with a reverent finger. He also began to shield her. When they walked among the pack, he saw the sideways glances, heard the muttered doubts that did not quite fade when he approached. A silent Luna, how can she lead? The bond must be a mistake. One afternoon, a warrior named Rorik, who had openly hoped Pax would choose his sister, stepped directly into Felicity's path, his posture challenging. Before a single word could be exchanged, Pax was there. He did not growl or shout. He simply moved, his larger body positioning itself seamlessly between Felicity and the warrior. He didn't even look at Rorik. His stormy gaze was fixed on Felicity, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Only then did Pax turn his head, his look so cold and full of authority that Rorik immediately dropped his eyes, muttered an apology and retreated. Felicity, standing safely behind the wall of her alpha, felt a new, foreign sensation: safety. One evening, a week after the ceremony, Pax found her standing on the balcony, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill. The moon was a thin silver claw in the sky. She was not looking at the forest but down into the dark, as if seeing something he could not. The sadness radiating from her was a physical force. He walked out to stand beside her, leaning his forearms on the cold stone railing. "It is lonely, isn't it?" he said, his voice quiet. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the same darkness. Being at the top. Everyone sees the alpha, the leader. They don't see the man who carries every worry, who makes every decision that could mean life or death. They see the title, not the person inside. He spoke of the weight of command, of the long nights spent planning for winter, of the constant, gnawing responsibility for every soul in his care. He had never voiced these thoughts to anyone. They were an alpha's vulnerability, a secret weakness. But here, in the dark, with this silent girl, it felt safe to let them out. He felt a gentle pressure on his hand. He looked down. Felicity had placed her small, cool hand over his much larger one. Her touch was light, but it sent a current of warmth shooting up his arm, straight to his heart. It was not the explosive magic of the bond, but something quieter, more profound. It was a touch of understanding, of shared loneliness. In that moment, the quiet between them was no longer awkward. It was comfortable. It was peace. The next day he decided to teach her something practical. He took her to the edge of the training grounds where the forest began. "Tracking," he said. "It is about more than scent. It is about feeling the forest." He led her to a patch of soft earth, pointing out the faint, almost invisible impression of a deer's hoof. "See how the edges are sharp? It passed recently." He stood close to her, pointing over her shoulder. He could smell the faint, clean scent of her hair, like sunlight and wild herbs. "Now you try," he murmured, his voice low near her ear. "Find the next print." Felicity leaned forward, her body tense with concentration. She took a small, hesitant step, then another, her eyes scanning the ground. She pointed to another faint mark a few feet away and looked back at him, her eyes asking a silent question. A surge of pride in something else, something warmer and more possessive, filled him. Yes, he said, stepping up directly behind her to confirm the track. He placed his hands on her shoulders to gently guide her stance. The moment his skin touched hers through the fabric of her dress, it happened. It was not a gentle warmth. It was a jolt, a spark of pure, undiluted lightning that shot through both of them. Felicity gasped, a sharp, soundless intake of air. Pax's hands tightened on her shoulders instinctively, his whole body going rigid. The world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact. The air crackled with a spicy electric energy that was the very essence of their mate bond awakening on a physical level. It was a pull, a deep, magnetic attraction that was suddenly impossible to ignore. His heart hammered against his ribs, and he could feel the frantic beat of her pulse under his thumbs. He looked down at the curve of her neck, at the delicate shell of her ear, and for the first time, the thought that she was his mate was not a magical abstract concept. It was a fierce, burning reality. She was a woman and he was a man, and the space between them felt like a distance that desperately needed to be closed. He forced himself to loosen his grip, to take a slow, shaky step back. The connection broke, but the echo of it vibrated in the air between them. Felicity turned to face him, her cheeks flushed a deep pink, her brown eyes wide and dark with a confusion that mirrored his own. She wasn't looking at her alpha anymore. She was looking at Pax the man. And he, for the first time, was truly seeing Felicity, not as the silent Omega, but as the woman who held the other half of his soul. The quiet of the forest was no longer peaceful. It was charged, alive with a new and dangerous understanding. The fragile peace that had begun to blossom between Pax and Felicity was shattered 1 week later by the frantic howl of a border sentry. It was a sound of alarm, sharp and piercing, cutting through the calm morning air. In an instant, the quiet, domestic life within the Alpha's quarters vanished, replaced by the grim reality of Pax's world. He was at the door in seconds, his body tense, his stormy eyes turning hard as flint. He looked back at Felicity, who stood frozen in the center of the room, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. There were no words of comfort he could offer, only a terse, "Stay inside. Bar the door." And then he was gone, the heavy door thudding shut behind him, leaving her alone in the sudden, deafening silence. Down in the main clearing, chaos was unfolding. The rival pack, the Shadow Fang, led by their brutal alpha, Zane, had crossed the border. Zane was everything Pax was not, cruel where Pax was just, chaotic where Pax was orderly. He craved the rich hunting grounds of the Stonefall territory, and he saw Pax's rumored lack of a true mate as a sign of weakness. The two packs clashed at the tree line, a furious storm of snarls and snapping jaws as wolves, and a cacophony of shouting and clashing weapons as humans. Pax, having shifted into his massive dark-furred wolf form, was a whirlwind of power at the center of the fray, his deep growls a rallying cry for his warriors. From the balcony of his quarters, Felicity watched the battle below, her heart a trapped bird beating against her ribs. Her eyes never left Pax's dark wolf form. She saw him fight with a fierce, graceful strength, protecting his pack, driving back the invaders. But then she saw Zane. The Shadow Fang Alpha, a hulking, scarred man with cruel eyes, was not focusing on the main fight. He was watching Pax. He was studying him. And then, his gaze followed the line of Pax's most defensive, protective movements, and it landed directly on the balcony. On her. A vicious smile spread across Zane's face. He had found the key. He barked an order to two of his largest warriors, and they broke away from the main fight, slipping into the shadows of the fortress, heading straight for the Alpha's quarters. Felicity's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled back from the balcony, her mind racing. She heard the heavy, pounding footsteps on the stone stairs outside, then the thunderous crash as they began to ram the door to the main room. The wooden bar groaned and splintered. Inside, Felicity stood her ground. Fear was a cold river pouring through her veins, but beneath it was something stronger, something solid and unyielding that had been growing since the ceremony. It was her love for Pax, for the man who had shown her patience, who had seen her not as broken but as whole. The door burst open with a final, shattering crack, and Zane stood in the doorway, his two warriors flanking him. He looked her up and down, a mocking leer on his face. "So this is the great weakness," he sneered, taking a step into the room. The mighty Pax, brought low by a mute Omega. He must be truly desperate. His warriors chuckled, the sound ugly in the space that had only known quiet understanding. "Grab her. He'll surrender the territory to get his precious little mate back." As the warriors moved toward her, Felicity did not cower. She did not try to run or scream. She stood perfectly still, her hands clenched at her sides. She closed her eyes, blocking out their advancing forms, their taunting laughter. She reached inward to the golden humming thread that connected her to Pax. She poured every ounce of her feeling into it, not fear, not panic, but strength. She sent him the memory of his hand on hers in the dark, the jolt of their touch in the forest, the safety she felt standing behind him. She sent him a wave of pure, unwavering belief, a silent scream of love and courage that was more powerful than any sound. It was a torrent of feeling, a flood of her silent heart flowing directly into his. Across the battlefield, Pax was locked in a struggle with a Shadowfang lieutenant when it hit him. It was not a sound but a sensation, a surge of power so potent it felt like the sun had exploded inside his chest. His vision sharpened, his muscles flooded with new incalculable strength, and a roar of pure protective fury erupted from his wolf throat that shook the very trees. He threw the lieutenant aside as if he were a mere leaf. His gaze, burning with a new, terrifying light, scanned the battlefield and found Zane missing. He knew. With a single, earth-shaking bound, he broke away from the fight and raced toward his home. He arrived just as Zane's warrior was reaching for Felicity's arm. Pax, still in his wolf form, did not hesitate. He launched himself into the room, a dark bolt of rage. He moved with a speed that was blinding, dispatching the two warriors with efficient, brutal force before they could even fully turn. Then he turned on Zane. The fight was short and merciless. Empowered by Felicity's love, fueled by a need to protect his mate, Pax was unstoppable. He pinned Zane to the ground, his powerful jaws closing around the rival alpha's throat, not to kill but to submit. A low, guttural growl promised death if he did not yield. The fight drained from Zane's eyes, replaced by the bitter taste of defeat. Pax shifted back to his human form, his chest heaving, his body streaked with dirt and blood. He didn't even look at the defeated alpha he held beneath him. His eyes found Felicity. She was still standing in the same spot, her body trembling, but her chin was held high, her eyes clear and dry. In that moment she was not a victim, she was the reason for his victory. He dragged Zane to his feet, shoving him toward his own retreating warriors. The message was clear. The battle was over. As the Shadowfang pack fled, the Stonefall pack gathered in the clearing, their eyes turning toward the broken door of their alpha's home, and the two figures standing within. Pax walked to Felicity. He didn't care about the blood, the dirt, the dozens of eyes watching them. He stood before her, this small, silent woman who had wielded a weapon no one else could see. His voice, when he spoke, was strong and clear, carrying across the suddenly silent pack. "You all saw a weakness," he declared, his gaze sweeping over his people before returning to Felicity, filled with a reverence no one had ever seen there. "You saw her silence and you thought it was broken. But you were wrong. Her strength is not in her voice. It is in her heart. It is a quiet strength, a deep strength, and it is the strongest thing I have ever known. She is my true mate. She is my Luna. And anyone who does not respect her, does not respect me." He then reached out, his hand still rough from the fight, cupping her cheek. It was the most tender gesture the pack had ever witnessed from their stern leader. Felicity leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a brief second, a single tear finally escaping to trace a path through the dust on her cheek. That night, under a blanket of stars, the pack celebrated their victory, but Pax and Felicity finally found their own peace. They stood together on the balcony, the forest below them quiet once more. The space between them, which had once been filled with awkwardness and uncertainty, was now gone. Pax turned to her, his large hands coming to rest on her waist, drawing her gently against him. "I don't need to hear your voice to know your heart," he whispered, his forehead leaning against hers. "I feel it. It speaks to mine. It is the bravest, most beautiful sound I have ever known. I love you, Felicity." He bent his head and his lips finally met hers. It was not a rushed or hungry kiss, but a slow, deep, and profound sealing of their bond. It was a promise of patience, of understanding, and of a love that did not need words to be real. It was a kiss that held all the silent conversations they had ever shared and all the spoken ones yet to come. As they stood there, wrapped in each other and the light of the moon, the silent Omega and the lonely Alpha were no more. They were simply Pax and Felicity, two halves of a single, unbreakable whole, their unique love story finally and perfectly complete. If you've been swept away by the quiet strength of Felicity and the protective love of Pax, and you want to join us for more stories where love triumphs in the most unexpected ways, make sure to subscribe. Your support helps us continue to tell tales of unique bonds and unforgettable romance, and it lets you know the moment our next adventure begins.